myself. Okay, great. All right. Now we go into the distinction between the father's house and the mother's house. So just a few words for those who missed the class, right? Just to recap, and you guys should be writing. You should be writing. Where are your notes? Ah, you're good. Make sure, finally, you got your computer out. Okay, excellent. Okay, main thing we're doing, just to recap, so for the computer, main thing we're doing is we're exploring the matriarchal voices in the Hebrew Bible, where because the Hebrew Bible is more than a patriarchal text, it also has a very strong feminine flavor. This is what we are going to turn to, and we're entitling these texts, or this family of texts, the mother's house. And again, we are going to think the mother's house in counterpoint with the father's house. We're not replacing one with the other. We're thinking of them together, just like in the book of Proverbs, when King Solomon says, "My son, listen to your father's teachings and do not forget your mother's with instruction or wisdom." All right, so now we need to look into the differences. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 main differences between the father's house and the mother's house, and this will be the basis of our whole class. This is the foundation. First main distinction: masculine versus feminine. Okay. So first thing you will notice as you enter the texts of the mother's house, and by the way, I haven't given you the list of texts, so I will now. These are typically the texts that are found in the wisdom literature of the Bible. So if you're familiar a little bit with the Jewish reading of the Hebrew Bible, you have the Hebrew Bible is divided in 3 main sections. You have the 5 books of Moses, you have the prophets, so 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and so forth. And then you have something called the writings or wisdom literature. And these books typically are not so well known. They're not usually read, regularly. Either in the church or the synagogue, you will not hear about these books regularly. I wonder, I don't think I have ever heard about the Song of Songs in the church, right? Or even the book of Job. In the synagogue, these texts will be typically read once a year for different festivals, but they're not read on a weekly basis, right? So these are kind of what I call the lost, forgotten texts, right? Yes.
Same objection I had last class is that we do read Song of Songs.
Song of Songs, yes. Song of Songs is read on Shabbat, right? So yes, you're right. But in general, right, Book of Job or Book of Ecclesiastes, Book of Proverbs, maybe Proverbs 31 for the woman, right? That's read every Friday night. But typically the other texts, Esther, Ruth, this is read during the festivals, right? Once a year. So these are kind of what I call the lost and forgotten books of the Hebrew Bible. And these are also the books which feature the strongest feminine flavor, right? And that's why we're going to turn. So take note, these are the texts we're going to look at, which belong to this group of texts. Where did I write them? I wrote them somewhere. Okay, I'll just, Genesis, I believe, belongs there, especially the first 11 chapters. Not typically, the book of Genesis is not classified by the rabbis as a wisdom text, but I'm going to put it there, right, for now, especially the early text of Genesis. The book of Job, we're going to study also, the book of Job. Then we'll go to the book of Ruth, same family. And then we will turn to all of the texts of King Solomon. These are all very, very influenced by or very replete with the feminine. Book of Proverbs, Book of Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs. Do you guys need me to write this on the board, or do you know these books already? Who needs me to write these books on the board? Everybody good? Okay. So Song of Songs. And then we'll end, the next to last book is the book of Esther. And then we will end with the book of John in the Christian Bible, which in my view belongs still to this tradition and has some very, very strong female characters. So we will also, we'll merge it with our wisdom books. Okay, so those are typically the books that are in the wisdom literature of the Hebrew Bible. I've added Genesis and John, right? But the others are all traditionally classified there. Okay, so first distinction, back to our 5 distinctions. Feminine, masculine. Okay, first thing we will notice in a lot of these books that I mentioned, strong female protagonist, right? Very strong female protagonist in Ruth, in Esther, Song of Songs, Genesis. And the book of Job also has some interesting, very strong, not protagonists, but a lot of metaphors pertain to the feminine. You have very strong female characters in the book. We'll see, for example, his wife, who is often ignored in the story, but is very important. Other book, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, is not so much a feminine character as the presence of what we call Lady Wisdom. So wisdom is the topic of the book of Ecclesiastes and the book of Proverbs. And wisdom typically, and this is very important, and I'll come back to this over and over again, wisdom in the ancient Near East is embodied by a woman. Typically, wisdom is embodied by a goddess in the ancient Near East, right? And it's seen to be a feminine attribute, right? And we'll study this. So anytime you're talking about wisdom, you're going to have references to the woman, right? Because the woman is seen in a way as the embodiment of wisdom. This is why men, listen to your wives. They are the embodiment of wisdom put on this earth for you, right? So typically you have a lot of female protagonists, but you also have this very central character of Lady Wisdom, who is metaphor, seen as a woman, right? So you have that also. Lady Wisdom is an offshoot, we'll see, of, I mean, there are connections between Lady Wisdom and the ancient goddesses of the ancient Near East. So we're going to look at those connections, actually. In the ancient Near East, wisdom is embodied by a woman. The goddess Inanna, which we're going to study, actually. I'll put her spell, because it's unknown. Inanna, who then later becomes Ishtar, right? So when Sumer is in charge, this is the empire of Sumer, this goddess is called Inanna. When the Babylonians take over, right, they win the war, they keep the goddess but change the name to Ishtar. And then the Canaanites decide that they're going to also worship this goddess, and they call her, and we know her from the Bible, Asherah. Boom, all the same one, right? This is all the same figure. So you had these, so the mention of Lady Wisdom in the Hebrew Bible is not isolated, right? It is in a way coming from this tradition. And all three goddesses, right, are associated with wisdom. In Egypt, by the way, you also have Isis, right? Not the Isis we know, right? Isis, the goddess, also associated with wisdom. So this text, right? The text of the Hebrew Bible is not written in a vacuum. It's coming from a tradition where wisdom is feminine, where the embodiment of wisdom is a goddess. And then you have, of course, in the Hebrew Bible, a reworking of that, right? They're not just copying, they're telling the story in their own way. And we'll see there how they do that. So that's the first thing you will notice, right? In these texts is the strong feminine presence, right? Okay. Any questions on that first, or comments, or shivers, or moments of despair? Anybody? Okay. Second thing that oh, I want to say a few more words about the connection between these goddesses and Lady Wisdom, and some of the female protagonists also, such as, so you will find these traits, right? Traits of these goddesses you will find in several moments of the Hebrew Bible. You will find them in Lady Wisdom, right? In the book of Proverbs, right? When wisdom is, calling to people in the street, come to my banquet, etc. I call her Lady Wisdom. You will find in Esther, which, by the way, is a Hebrew rendition of Ishtar, right? Esther is actually, the real name of Esther is Ishtar. It's a Persian name, right? You find again traits of the goddess in Song of Songs, Ruth, and especially Eve. Okay, and we'll study these. Now, I want to talk about how do we think this connection between this pagan literature, this cultic literature of the goddess, and the Hebrew women protagonists, right? Remember, the Hebrew religion is profoundly monotheistic. There's one God, and he's not female, right? So there's no goddess next to God hovering around, right? So how do they do it? Why are they drawing on these traditions? How are they connecting the two? Many commentators have looked at this, that the Hebrew writers who are writing these texts and borrowing motifs from the goddess are actually doing something called, they're not copying, they're doing a polemic, yes, they're not replicating, but they are borrowing the themes, the images in a polemic way. So I want to explain that. How are they doing this? So they're not just copying. People can tell you, oh, Hebrew Bible is just copying from the Epic of Gilgamesh, or it's just copying from this particular document, right? It's true, they're borrowing, but they're not just borrowing, they're transforming, they're adapting, they're shifting even in the meaning in order to challenge the pagan way of seeing things. And we're going to see that. The way the Hebrews talk about the woman is going to be, of course, they borrow, but they also challenge the dominant worldview of the ancient Near East. And we're going to see how they do that over and over again. They borrow from the text of Inanna and Ishtar. We have texts, right, where so they're familiar with these texts. They know these motives, but they borrow, but then they borrow in a way to challenge the concepts of the ancient Near East, the concepts of God, the concepts of the female. Are you seeing very clearly what they're doing? Right? It's very important. So don't be shocked if they borrow, right? It's not a big deal. They're borrowing because that is the material they're working with. A lot of the Hebrew writers were reading, right? They are, especially for Inanna, there are actual texts that we have, right? Stories of Inanna that we have found in archaeology. So we have it, and the Hebrew writers, especially someone like King Solomon, who was very cultured and well-read, they had access to these cultic texts. So they read, they incorporate, but then when they write, they transform, and they write in a way that becomes then a challenge to the worldview of the ancient Near East, right? So we're going to look how they do that. Okay, so that's pretty clear. All right, let's go to the next distinction: vertical versus horizontal. So in the Father's house, typically, things are pretty vertical. God speaks, and there's a revelation from God, a word of God, and people receive the word and obey the word very clearly, right? So God, in a way, is the one doing most of the speaking, and then when he speaks, human beings obey. In the 5 books of Moses, mostly it is God speaking and human beings writing down his words as law, right? So the word of God is law for the human. There's not much of a dialogue, although you can disagree. You have some dialogue in the book of Genesis, right? Moses also is in dialogue with God. And that's perhaps elements of the mother's house infiltrating, right? But in general, right, there's quite of an authoritarian voice. God's word is law, right? And the people follow this law, right? And usually God's word is revealed from above, right? Especially in the 5 books of Moses, you have Moses climbing a mountain to receive the words of God. There is an elevation needed to connect to God. And then you have this, of course, in the prophets, right? God speaks to the prophet, and then the prophet reveals what God has said. In the wisdom books, God, which was center stage in the Pentateuch, in the books of the prophets, now is taking backstage. And now most of the speaking is done between human beings. Notice, this is really, I just noticed this now. Most of the conversations in the book of Genesis are between who and who? Anybody know? Yes.
God and Moses?
Yeah, God and people. If you look at most of the conversations that are taking place in the Garden of Eden, God and Adam, later, God and Cain, God and Noah, God and Abraham, they're talking a lot. Human beings are talking a lot with them. Between each other, there's not much conversation. One of the most poignant moments of this lack of conversation is Cain and Abel, right? God has finished talking to Cain, right? And Cain talks to Abel, and there's nothing that is being said, right? And immediately after, he kills him. So we have kind of the conversations are not that great between human beings. They're much richer between God and humans. But now in the wisdom text, this flips. Now you have very rich conversations between human beings, and God has kind of receded backstage. He's not talking so much. But what we notice in the text is that God, in a way, emerges actually from those conversations. And God, in a way, is found no more in the sky up there. God is now to be found between human beings. God arises, right? The divine arises, the divine power is awakened from what is occurring between human beings. I'm reminded here of Martin Buber, who said this beautifully in his book, I Am Thou, right? God is between humans, between us. This is where the way we interact with each other either reveals or occults God. It can reveal or it can hide God. So there is we'll talk about this, of course, in much more detail, but this notion that the way we interact, what we say to each other can can awaken divine power, or it can weaken divine power. I'll give you one quick example. The Book of Ruth, we'll talk about that, of course. God, in the Book of Ruth, there's a number of conversations between Ruth and her mother-in-law, Ruth and Boaz, her future husband. They're all talking, and only in the end, God is actually doing something, right? What made God move, if not these conversations, right? So there's something in human conversation which is profoundly holy. And the way we converse with each other can either bring God closer or dispel God, right? So we're going to see this, right? That God in a way is between us. His power or his presence is brought into the situation through the conversation and initiatives between human beings, right? It's a very different approach. God is not, yes?
It means deals with, you know, Ben Adam Lechavero means?
Who?
Ben Adam Lechavero.
Explain, please.
It's like a man to his fellow man, how he behaves, and it's more important the relationship between people, to the relationship that each person has with God.
Yep.
Because if we act in the right way, you know, maybe towards each other, then God will favor us and see us favorably.
Exactly. Right. So that's one of the main teachings of Judaism, when God says, love me with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and then just right after, love your neighbor as yourself, right? So they're connected. And in this context, so God in a way, of course, is found when we love God, but God is also found when we love each other, right? God is also present and activated, or you know, in the language of today, magnetized, right, by the way that we interact with each other. There's a beautiful quote in the Talmud. Let me write that word for those of you who don't know. Talmud is the commentaries of the rabbis of the biblical text. Beautiful expression in the Talmud that says, when a man and a woman are pleasing to God, God's presence dwells with them, right? So speaking of a couple, right? When we have a human couple, when a husband and a wife are pleasing to God, so when their interaction is pleasing to God, God dwells with them, right? Meaning when their interactions are not pleasing to God, God just and then all that is left is strife, right? So that's one idea, right? That God in a way can be magnetized, can be pulled down to earth by the way that we interact with each other. And we'll see this very strongly, especially in the story of Ruth. Do you have a question? No, okay. All right, good. So that's the second main difference, right? Between father's house and the mother's house. In the father's house, God actually, first of all, is the main speaker. He's the one doing the speaking, but he's also the one doing the acting. God is very forceful in the father's house. He's doing miracles. He's saving people from Egypt. He's intervening strongly, powerfully, like a warrior. And that's great, right? It's wonderful. Love stories, some of my favorite stories. But in the mother's house, there's no more miracles, no more grand entry of God, right? God is not performing powerful, you know, masculine, virile, manly miracles. God is, you don't see, where is he? He's there in the interactions, much more subtle now, right? God is acting much more subtly in the mother's house than in the father's house, where he's coming, you know, with chariots of fire, right? Intervening for his people. Okay, third distinction, law versus wisdom. Law versus wisdom. Okay, so obviously in the father's house, the law is the centerpiece, right? This is what it means to be Jewish, right? You're Jewish, you follow the law. You keep the commandments. This is what shapes your Jewish identity. Or Christians have, you know, a different way of approaching this, but since for Christians we have moved beyond the commandments, I don't know if that was a good idea, but nevertheless, the commandments are the center, right? This is what it means to be a believer. Is you listen, you have faith that God knows what he's doing, you listen, and then you follow. And in fact, this is the key for happiness, right? If you want to be happy, you follow the law. I love the image that is given in the Jewish tradition of the law is compared to a tree of life, right? We lost the tree of life. If you're familiar with the story of the Garden of Eden, we lost the tree of life, right? Because we sinned or whatnot. The tree of life came back in the shape of a scroll, And as you partake, as you swallow, as you meditate, as you digest the scroll, you are it as though you are eating from the tree of life. You are acquiring eternal, immortal life by contact with the law, with the text, right? So a beautiful rendition, right? That when you follow God, when you obey God, you are choosing life. You have a better life, not just because God is happy and He's blessing you, but because it's good advice. Right? Any of these laws, I think even the minor laws, the great philosopher Maimonides, really dedicated part of his life to showing that even the minor laws that we don't understand, like why I can't eat a cheeseburger, right? Can't mix milk with, meat, found that there's health reasons for this. Even, things like circumcision, we know there's always very rational reasons why these laws are there. These laws are there to guide us into the path of happiness because we don't know. Okay, that's the father's house. Now, mother's house is the opposite. Mother's house is not based on the law. It's based on wisdom. What does that mean? Wisdom, unlike the law, is not coming from God. Wisdom is coming from experience. You become wise because you've lived a crazy life, right? In fact, that is why the father in the book of Proverbs says, listen to me, your father, who knows life, who's lived, who's transgressed, who's made mistakes, who's stumbled, fell, picked myself back up. I know things. What?
Have to go, right?
Oh, you gotta go. Okay, no problem. All right, so this is right. This is the wisdom is not coming from a divine voice in the Hebrew Bible. Wisdom is coming from experience, from engaging with life. Now, experience we know is not always easy. You stumble, you fall, you pick a wrong direction, you come back, you make mistakes. Sometimes you even trespass, you sin. And from these experiences, you acquire wisdom. King Solomon, he did everything. That's why he was wise, right? He was not a very good Jew, but he was a wise one, right? So we have a very different view on transgression in the mother's house. And I want to emphasize this a little bit because this is the tricky part. But if you can understand this, something's going to explode in your head. You will never be the same. Let me explain this very carefully. In the mother's house, there is a lot of leniency for transgression. And I will explain why. First of all, because through transgression, when we make a mistake, is when we really learn what is the right thing, what is the wrong thing, right? There is really wisdom that can arise from making mistakes, from stumbling around. So that's the first thing, obviously, right? That transgression can be a path back to God, back to the divine embodiment of wisdom. There's another reason why transgression is considered somewhat accepted in the mother's house. And it has to do with the definition of God. In the father's house, God is judge. Judge, meaning if you make that mistake, it will be written down. And you will have an accounting. And things will, right, there will be consequences. And you will be held accountable for what you did here against this person, right? This is the God as judge. In the mother's house, God is creator. Now, if you are a creative person, what do you like most? Tell me. You're a creative person, you like to create. What is the basis? What shows us that you're a good artist? What is the feature of the artist? What does the artist start with, basically? Does the artist start with a raw product or with finished product? When you're an artist, do you go to the Louvre and take down a painting and then, that's art? What do you do when you're an artist? What do you work with? What's the materials? What do the materials look like? Are they finished or unfinished?
Raw product, unfinished, blank canvas.
Absolutely, right? If you're working from some other creation, you're not an artist. You're copying. I don't know. Artist loves raw material. Artist loves chaos because ooh, yeah, now I can do something with this, right? By the way, this is great comparison. Have you noticed these amazing women who fall in love with losers? Yeah. Maybe you're one of them, right, ladies? I have two, three ladies, right? And you're like, why she loves this guy? He's no nobody. Why do you think she loves this guy? Based on this? She's creative. And she's like, ooh, unfinished man. Let me see what I can do with this guy. This is what we are thinking. Now you know. right? High achieving woman. You're like, what's she with this loser? He doesn't have a job. He's on drugs. What's she doing? She's creating, guys. She sees the potential. God is exactly like that woman. He sees a complete loser. He's like, oh, let me see what I can do with this guy. This is exciting, raw material. So when we make mistakes, when we trespass, in a way, somewhere, God is sitting on his throne getting excited. Isn't that crazy? I love it, right? So he's getting excited because he's like, ooh, big mistake, big chaos, horrible situation. Now let me see what I can do with this, right? This is the God as creator. God as judge is not so happy. God as judge is like, oh man, he messed up again, right? I got to write it down, right? God as creator is like, huh, now I can do something with this person. Now there's something to work with, right? And in a way, what I'm talking about really is the ability of God or the desire or the enjoyment of God to take our mistakes and transform them into wisdom, experience, and success, beauty, right? God is the God who takes the ugly and enjoys making it beautiful. It excites him, right? And this is a completely different view of God than you've ever had, probably, because we have been raised in the Father's house, right? Which is fine. It's okay to be fearful, to make mistakes. I think it's very good in the Father's house to be like afraid to hurt somebody. That's great. That's the Father's house. Will make you afraid to hurt somebody. In the mother's house, there's a little more leniency. Okay, you hurt them. Now let's see what God can make out of this catastrophe that you have created for yourself, right? So that is the essence, by the way, of grace, right? We don't often talk of grace in the Hebrew Bible, but you have the equivalent concept in the Hebrew, which is chesed, right? For those of you who know Hebrew, that is what I'm talking about. Grace is the translation of chesed. This is when you get something undeserved. You mess up, you made this mistake, you hurt this person, and yet look at you where you are now. Unbelievable. That's grace. You did not deserve to make it this far. You made all these mistakes and you hurt all these people, and yet here you are. That's grace. That's chesed. You can only taste grace when you have tasted transgression. This is, I'm crazy, I know what I'm saying, but let me say it again. You can only taste grace when you have tasted transgression. And if you're judging me right now, we all transgress. So don't think you're all gonna make stupid mistakes and terrible mistakes, right? And you will be happy to remember what I have just told you, right? This is why in the Talmud again, it is said that when we are all back, when God conquers the earth, when we are all in, paradise, the humans will have a seat closer to God than the angels. Why do you think that is? We'll be higher. We'll have a higher status in heaven than the angels, human beings. Why? We're not as clever as the angels. We can't fly. We're not as, positive as the angels. Why we have a higher honor in heaven than the angels? Why do you think, based on what I said? Yes.
Because we have free will, we have the ability to make mistakes and learn to grow.
Angels too. We hear about fallen angels and they big mistakes. It's more than free will. Angels also have free will, actually. They're not just, robots. I mean, we think sometimes they look, but they're not. They can choose, right? There is stories of angels disobeying, transgressing. So it's not free will. It's something else. What is it that makes us higher than the angels in the accounting of God? Based on what I just said, the answer should be on the tip of your tongue. Yes, Michael, and then you. Oh, you're both. I'm sorry. You're not even Michael. You're Davidov, the Davidovs. Davidov number 1 and then Davidov number 2.
I'm Davidovich.
Davidovich, sorry. Yes, Davidovich. Okay.
So difference would be that the angels are always perfect, they're always divine, good, and the humans had to rise up to gain that status.
Okay, so that's one way to see it. Like we had to work hard to get, but it's not just that. Tell me.
Because we made mistakes, came back.
Exactly. The fact that we made mistakes and experienced grace, we know something more of God than the angels do who never made mistakes. We are closer, more intimate. We love God more because we are so grateful. I messed up and yet you brought me here, right? This, the angel cannot feel because the angel always does the right thing. But we know we are so grateful for falling so low and being rescued and set so high. And the love we feel exceeds that an angel can feel, which has never had this kind of experience, right? We have tasted grace, the angels have not. And therefore, we have a deeper insight into the divine nature offend the angels. Yes.
But you did say that the angels make mistakes.
Yes, but we make, yes, those angels, we don't even know. Yeah, that's a good point. But in general, right, we have made more mistakes collectively. We are the civilization of mistakes, right? But you're right. If the angel has made a mistake, they will be probably, right? The rabbis don't talk about that because the rabbis think the angel don't make mistakes. So that particular quote, the premise is that angels don't make mistakes. I'm the one saying they make mistakes. The rabbis don't think so. But so based on the premise of the rabbis that the angels don't make mistakes, we are higher because not because we transgressed or hurt someone, but because we have tasted grace as a result of our transgression, right? So that's something so, if you can put that, if you can wrap your mind around this, you are already almost completely in the mother's house. You are able to enter this very different worldview, right? It takes a lot. If you're used to the father's house, it's gonna take some gymnastics. You got to do some stretches, right, in order to get there. It's like you're gonna have to like get a bit loose, right, so that you can begin to enter into the mother's house. It's not easy to transition from the two, right? Some of us is gonna be easy. Some of us it's a little harder. But this is all really based on the biblical text, right? I'm not saying anything that's not there. Okay, great. Last two. Separation versus integration. Separation versus integration. So in the father's house, typically, the attitude towards the world is we need to separate from the world. Let us remain holy, right? We don't want to be, you know, out there too much, getting tainted by, you know, we don't want to do certain experiences, go to certain places, hang out with certain people. I mean, you'll hear this a lot in the father's house. And by the way, it's great advice, right? I'm just saying. So, anything the father's house says is really great advice, right? It's true. Like if you start hanging out with idiots, you're going to become an idiot, right? If you start hanging out with losers, you're going to become a, so great advice. Mother's house is like, bring them all in. Let's welcome everybody, right? Losers, non-losers, sinners, transgressors. In a way, Jesus was very mother's house, right? Eating with prostitutes and, you know, hanging out with tax collectors, a very, very open approach, right? We'll see that a little bit in the book of John. So you have here this, and you see this in the text, right? We're going to look at each text, of course, individually, but just to give you an idea, book of Proverbs, of course, mostly written by King Solomon, but you have a few authors in there, which guess what, are from Canaan. Canaan. Do you know who Canaanites are? Who are they? Who are the Canaanites? Nobody remembers? Yes?
Like, I think they were very like uncivilized people.
Yes, they're the people God told Israel to exterminate because they're so uncivilized, barbaric, cruel, you know. So God is like, kill them. I don't want to see them anymore, right? And here we have in the mother's house, not only they're at the table, they're cooking for you. They're contributing to the canon. The biblical canon has included, via the mother's house, sages from Canaan. It's unbelievable. And in fact, Proverbs 31, which is read religiously every Friday night in the Jewish household, it's a blessing over the woman, is written by a Canaanite. Check it out. Just go verify. It's true. Right. So, yeah, that's insane. Yes, I know. Right. So you have Canaanites, which are the sworn enemies of Israel, participating in the authorship of these texts. Going further, the book of Ecclesiastes, now you have another sworn enemy of Israel in the book of Ecclesiastes, and it is the Egyptian connection. Scholars more and more are discovering that the book of Ecclesiastes is written by someone who is deeply learned, deeply well-versed in Egyptian language and Egyptian worldview. And this language and worldview is everywhere in the book of Ecclesiastes. And we might point out one most famous connection is there's nothing new under the sun. This is not a Hebrew expression. This is an idiomatic Egyptian expression. In fact, there's even a hieroglyph with this symbol of the sun and something underneath, right, which translates that expression. So that's just an example. So Egypt now has found its way in the Hebrew Bible, right? Egypt, the people who enslaved and oppressed the Hebrews for 400 years, is now there contributing to the canon, the biblical canon. A Song of Songs, you have a woman there who is probably not Jewish, right? She's described in terms that makes her racially different from, she's described as Black, right? She's not the same race. She's certainly not the same religion. She describes herself as not part of the community. right? She regrets that she has to hide, that she cannot freely love her Jewish partner because she's not Jewish, she's from the outside, right? And some people even go as far as to say that she probably had some African background, right? So we have here main protagonist, by the way, doing all the talking, doing the teaching, right? Not a Hebrew. So you can see how the mother's house, the best one, Book of Ruth. Ruth, the Moabite. Moab, the nation which God said, no Moabite will enter my assembly ever. And Ruth waltzes in, right? Becomes the grandmother of King David, right? One of the greatest kings of Israel. So you can see how the mother's house is actually very, is much more open, much more interested in including what the Hebrews refer to as the nations. Other nations are part here of the dialogue, of the discussion, they're at the table, right? Why? Because we are in the context of wisdom. And anytime you're in the context of wisdom, you know, I cannot find wisdom on my own. This is why Plato, to bring him up once in the class, it's called Plato and the Bible. Plato structured his work how? How did he write? Did he write long treatises? Did he write poems? What? Dialogues. Dialogues, why? Because wisdom is found in dialogue. And the Hebrew thinkers are really following the same Platonic idea that we cannot find wisdom alone. Wisdom, revelation, yes, I can sit here and God speaks, but wisdom, that's another story. That we find together. Now let's not forget that wisdom is the female face of God. So in a way, when we work together, talking, sharing information, we are coming closer to God. It's a very different approach. In the father's house, you approach God by keeping the commandments. In the mother's house, you approach God by talking with people who are radically different and having a inclusive conversation. Very different approach, but both lead to God, right? Again, mother's house, wisdom leads to God, commandments lead to God, right? So it's a very different approach here, very different path to God. Okay, any questions so far before we go to the last one? Anybody? Epstein, how are you doing? Okay, okay, all right, good. Anybody else? All right, excellent. Last one. Receiving versus doing. Receiving versus doing. This is what I distinguish this in more metaphorically. Temple versus garden, right? Temple versus garden. Okay. So in the Father's house, there's a lot of doing. You have commandments, you have rituals, you know, you got to go to the temple. These are the festivals. These are the times. You got to pray. You got to sacrifice. You got to do, you know, eat like this, you know, dress like that. All very good advice, right? So there's a lot of it's a very proactive, very masculine approach to spirituality. I come close to God through my different initiatives. By acting in a certain way, I come close to God, right? The mother's house is going to be completely different. And this is, in fact, my favorite part because I'm a doer. So I'm teaching this class almost for myself so I can remember. Mother's house, you approach God through rest, through rest and receptivity. You see, in the Father's house, we serve God, right? We go to the temple, the priest, the word for worship, by the way, avodah. We'll do a little Hebrew in this class. Avodah, which is the word for worship, also means work, right? It means two things at the same time. Worship or work. So when we enter the temple and do the sacrifices, or even now if we enter a synagogue or a church, we sing songs, we read prayers, we are doing. In the mother's house, it's not us who serve God, it is God who serves us. There, let that explode in your head, right? God serves us. This is the God of Psalm 23. When King David writes, you set up a table in front of me. You dress a table in front of me in the presence of my, he had to say that, in the presence of my enemies. That's King David. But God is seen as setting a table with rich, you know, fare, with amazing food, right? And it's not enough for David to just have the table. He wants it to be in the presence of his enemies. I want to take that, right? here's what God is doing for me. So, but that's the idea. God in the mother's house serves us, works for us, fights for us. It is not us who serve God. By the way, this is a radical reversal of the ancient Near Eastern concept of God. If you're familiar with the Sumerian religion, if you read some of the texts, you will see there that God created human beings in ancient Sumerian religion so that human beings can cultivate grain so that they can have beer and bread from the human beings, right? The role, they created the human beings so the human beings could work for them and bring them food and bring them beer from the wheat and bread from the wheat, right? That's why they created us. And then you have the book of Genesis, where God creates man in order to feed him. In the book of Genesis, you have we won't study sadly that text, but actually we might for Ecclesiastes, but God in a way is seen as giving to man food. And so you can see the polemic, right? Here, the Hebrew writer is responding to the ancient Near Eastern approach of creation. Ancient Near East, God creates so he can be fed. In the Genesis story, God creates so that he can feed us. And one of the leitmotifs, one of the words that is repeated over and over again is God giving, Natan, to the human being. God is the one providing food for the human being rather than the human being providing food for God. This is garden spirituality versus temple spirituality. Are you following? That's one of the main differences we'll see. The fact that God acts most, best, strongest when we are in a state of rest. And this is so hard because we want to control and do and make happen. But there is a way that we can, in a way, empower God by resting, right? Rest is one of the most powerful ways to empower God in our lives, right? And this is what we'll be learning over and over again. Okay, any questions? Good. I guess this classroom is okay. I don't know. I feel there's a big hole. I don't know. Do you guys want to move to 302 next week? What do you think? You don't care? Okay, I'm gonna ask if it's free, and then I'll leave probably a poster for whoever missed class. We'll do maybe a couple more classes for everyone to come, and then we'll probably move there because I don't know, this feels weird. Okay, great. Okay, so for next time, so next time is going to be very interesting. We are going to, for a couple of days, read some of the cultic texts of Inanna. So you will be introduced to the goddess Inanna. Why? Because she is everywhere in the Hebrew Bible. So there's so much borrowing from these texts in the Hebrew Bible. And also another reason, if you understand the text of Inanna, you can illuminate some difficult passages in the Hebrew Bible, especially Genesis 3. There are ways there are ways that the interpretation becomes very clear when you read it in the light of some of these texts on Inanna. And so this can help us actually see things that other people have not seen in the text. This can help us do exegesis on the text, interpret the text. So she's everywhere. We have to pass through her. And then I will be alluding to her. So I will put on Blackboard the text. There are two texts we're going to read. One is Inanna and the tree. So you will see connections with Eve and the tree. And the writer of Eve, or the storyteller of Eve, and is familiar. You have connections, linguistic connections. I mean, you can't get around it. You have same images and linguistic connections between the storyteller of Genesis 1 to 11 and these writers from Sumer. Especially if you want to explore deeper, read the Epic of Gilgamesh. There's a lot of language, the way the idiomatic expressions, stories that echo the text, the stories of Genesis 1 to 11, which, by the way, Moses not so much wrote as compiled, right? So, of course, Moses is not familiar so much, but whoever's told these stories, which Moses later brought into his own writing, is familiar with these Sumerian texts. So we have to know them to really be able to enter the text from the right perspective. I could go on and on. I will stop now. So I'm going to so your assignment for next time, for Thursday, I'll put the text of Inanna and the tree. The next text we will do is Inanna's wedding to Dumutsi. And those are the two texts we'll study. I will put them on Blackboard, and your assignment is to do the reading assignment on Inanna and to bring 2 copies, one for you, one for me, and that will be on, what day are we today? Tuesday, so Thursday. Thursday we'll do that. Okay? Any questions? No? Okay, let me stop the recording.